And the way Routley makes this argument against the sufficiency of the human chauvinism principle is with a series of what he calls counterexamples. So these are all cases where, if we think about them, Routley is arguing that if we think about these imaginary cases, then we'll see that the human chauvinism principle does not give us guidance about the right thing to do. In fact, it allows us to do things that are wrong. And so there must be something wrong with the human chauvinism principle, and therefore there must be something wrong with the entirety of the old ethics, that this principle is supposedly a distillation of, or a kind of a point of agreement or convergence between the various strains of ethical theory in the Western tradition. So the first counterexample, and definitely the most famous one from this paper, the one that gets talked about the most in subsequent literature, is the last man case. So Routley asks us to imagine this. He says, imagine that there's only one human being left on planet Earth. This is the last human being in the universe as far as this person knows. And all other humans have died, and there's no way for this person to perpetuate the race. There's no technology that would allow them to, say, clone themselves or make more people. So they know that they're the last human that is ever going to exist. They have every reason to believe that they're the last human that is ever going to exist. And the question is, would it be wrong? So say this last person, let's say, let's go with the gender neutral. This last person decides to, in their remaining days on Earth before they die, they're going to destroy as many plants and animals as they can. Okay. Now, is there anything wrong with that? Okay. So they're the last human that's ever going to exist on Earth. Let's just say they know that. Let's just say they know that. Okay. They know they're the last human that's ever going to exist. Did they do anything wrong by killing as many plants and animals as they could? Now, you can vary the scenario a little bit. You can ask different kinds of questions about it. Say that they go about just killing plants. Did they do something wrong then? Because, utilitarians might recognize there's something wrong about killing animals. But utilitarians wouldn't recognize there's something wrong with the person, say, starting as many, assuming that it didn't kill animals, starting as many forest fires as they could and just killing as many trees as they could, assuming that that won't negatively affect any animals on the planet. That there would be nothing wrong with them chopping down as many trees as they want, okay? And so Routley thinks that when we think about this case, we're going to respond by saying, yes, there is something wrong with that. He thinks that that's our natural reaction, is to say, even if there's only one human left on planet Earth, it's wrong for them to go about just destroying other life forms. There's something wrong with that, okay? And again, we can vary the scenario a little bit in a couple of different ways, interesting ways. We can ask, what if this last person goes about just killing off as many species as they can? Would we say there's something wrong with that? What if this last person goes, well, okay, I think that's good enough for a start. Let me talk through some of the other examples. So Routley says we can expand the last person example to become the last people example. Imagine that there's a whole society of people. Who knows, maybe it's 100, maybe it's 1,000, but these people know that they're the last human society that will ever exist on Earth. And maybe they know this because there's been some kind of radioactive fallout that prohibits any kind of reproduction. So they know they're the last set of humans on Earth. Is there anything wrong with them just killing off as many animals, plants, species, etc. as they want to? Would there be anything wrong with them paving down the entire Earth and making the whole thing into a parking lot before they die off? And I think, again, Routley thinks most of us would say, yeah, there's something wrong with that. Now, with both the last man example and the last people example, what's the point? The point is, human chauvinism says there's nothing wrong with this because people doing this doesn't harm other people. But we think there's something wrong with it. And Routley wants to say that what it shows is we need to add something to our old ethics. Now, in terms of our terminology that we have today of anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric ethical systems, we can see that what Routley is arguing for is it's basically an argument for some kind or some degree of non-anthropocentrism in our ethical systems. Because if we were just anthropocentric, if the only reason for our moral consideration for the environment was its effects on humans, then we wouldn't care at all with the last person killing off as many plants and animals as they wanted. We wouldn't care at all about the last people doing that. Those things wouldn't strike us as morally wrong. So the fact that they do strike us as morally wrong suggests that we are actually already non-anthropocentrists to some extent. Okay, that's our natural, or that is our that is actually how we feel about things. If we look at how we feel about things carefully, we believe nature is valuable, not just for the things that it brings to humans, but it's somehow intrinsically valuable. Okay, so that's a natural. Now Routley doesn't say it exactly that way because he doesn't have the terminology of anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric. That comes later in the discussion, but we can use that terminology to describe what he's doing in this article. And likewise, Routley says we can imagine these last people arriving on a distant planet and knowing for whatever reason that they are the last generation of humans that's going to live on that planet. Is there something wrong with that set of human colonizers on the new planet just destroying as many life forms as they can on the new planet? It seems like something would be wrong with that. So again, it seems like we don't think that human chauvinism is true. We think that there must be some non-anthropocentric ethical requirement on us. In the next few examples, Routley is in a way moving closer to something that looks like our own society. He's trying to get us to make the connection between the last man example, which is very clearly imaginary, almost like a science fiction scenario. And he's now going to move more towards describing situations that are more like situations that we see in the modern world. So he describes a person he calls the great entrepreneur. And this is someone who uses a lot of natural resources to, say, run a factory to produce some product, and then throws the product away when once it's been produced. And the idea here is that the great entrepreneur, he's using up these natural resources, killing off these plants and animals in whatever ways he is, to, say, increase the economic activity of the area, to give people jobs. He's doing it for reasons, we can imagine, that are helping people, okay? But nonetheless, we think that the fact that he's wasteful with the products, that he's using the natural materials just to produce this benefit for humans, but that in some way he's not paying sufficient attention to the harm done to the environment, is wrong. Even if it has positive effects for humans, there's still something wrong about it. And then Routley asks us to imagine expanding that to the industrial society and imagine that there's a whole society of such people. So he's just asking us to imagine a case where we have someone who's increasing economic activity and economic output, but at the cost of some set of lives of non-human animals and plants and maybe species and features of the natural environment. And we're to ask whether or not we think that that's okay to just increase economic activity, help people, but at the expense of the environment. And then the last example is the vanishing species example. He says, imagine that there's no clear economic benefit to keeping some species alive, say a species of blue whale. And in fact, there's evidence that driving the species to extinction would have more economic benefit for human beings, that is, would be better for human communities. should we drive the blue whale to extinction? And I think Routley clearly wants to say, at least a lot of us feel like a species should be protected just because it's a species, and we don't have a right to eliminate it, or it would be less good for us to eliminate it than for us to eliminate it. That in some sense, the goodness of having a species is not just the economic goodness of having a species. That the goodness of a species, its demand on us for moral consideration, is not just a matter of its usefulness for us or its economic value, but that it has some kind of claim to value independent of its usefulness for us. And that's, I think, what he's trying to get us to see with this last example. So that brings us to the end of Routley's paper. You can ask whether you agree with the main point that he wants to make, particularly with the last man example. And you can also, you should notice that a lot of this paper is kind of exploratory, that Routley is kind of discovering things along the way of writing about these topics. It's not a very established set of positions, or it's not very clear. It's not entirely clear. I think it's not entirely clear even to Routley what he's doing. The part of it that is pretty clear is he's trying to argue that we need some kind of new ethic and why we do. He's trying to analyze why we do by looking at the conflict between the human chauvinism principle and examples like the last man example. Okay, so that part I think is fairly clear. But reading it today in hindsight of the subsequent discussion in environmental ethics, I think we see some of these issues a bit more clearly than Routley, and we can say that what he's really trying to do is argue for the need for a non-anthropocentric ethics.